On this episode of the WildFed podcast.
Ikejime is a very deliberate handling process to slaughter a fish for the highest class eating products in the world.
The cow gets the captive bolt to the brain, it's strung up and bled immediately. But then so many of the fish that we end up eating have suffocated to death in the sun on the deck of a boat.
How do we even begin to empower a forgotten industry? I want to go straight for the jugular. And the jugular in this situation is the U.S. federal government.
It's like Civil War era surgery or something, the way we deal with fish. And so it seems like we are ready for some kind of huge overhaul.
You've hacked the central nervous system. Now this muscle tissue doesn't know it's dead.
There's something there for everybody. Even if you don't care about animal stress, what quality of food do you want to eat?
That is the difference between world class and like really, really fresh. And hey, Michelin star chef or not, you can experience it.
Episode 129 of the WildFed podcast, Ike Jime, How to Kill a Fish with Andrew Choi, is brought to you by Thrival. Thrival. Why just survive when you can thrive? Thrival.com is your source for nature-based supplements that keep you thriving in the modern world. From hormone health to immune support, increased metabolism to exercise recovery, Thrival keeps you thriving when others are just surviving. Check out their pine pollen pure potency for testosterone support, colostrum for a smoothie ingredient that's 3 times more effective against flu than vaccines, elk antler for powerful growth and recovery, medicinal mushrooms for immunomodulation and powerful antioxidant capacity, and vitamin D3 for all the protective properties you've been hearing about during this pandemic. Go to Thrival.com to see the entire lineup and use the coupon code WildFed for 5% off your order. Thrival. Why just survive when you can thrive? Season 2 of our TV show WildFed is now on the air. That's right, 10 new episodes are airing on the Outdoor Channel Monday nights at 7:30 p.m. Eastern and again at 10:30 p.m. This week's episode takes place in Savannah, Georgia, where I'll be spending a week with my good friend Chef Tony Seachrist for some near and offshore fishing, blue crabbing, and hog hunting. Tony's an incredible forward-thinking chef, and he knows his way around wild ingredients. After all, his dockside restaurant is called The Wild. Next week is episode 10, the final episode of the season, and this one's really special to me. It stars just 2 people, myself and my wife Ivani, and it follows us as I hunt squirrels and she gathers acorns. You'll see how we process acorns, break down squirrels, and what we like to cook with them. I'll be preparing acorn-breaded fried squirrel legs, and Ivani will be making an acorn maple dessert bread. You'll even see the acorn flour deconstructed crouton I make for our salad. It's my favorite episode of the season, so be sure to check that one out. Hey, if you don't have cable, and let's face it, most of us don't, you can watch the show live as it airs on friendlytv.com. That's spelled friendly without the vowels, FRNDLY TV.com. You can get a free trial subscription if you want to watch this Monday's episode, and after that, it's just $6.99 a month. Here at WildFed, we are so proud to have a second season on the air, and we really hope you'll tune in either on Outdoor Channel or friendlytv.com. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Andrew Choi is the founder of the Ike Jime Federation, and he's on a mission. He aims to change the way we as commercial and recreational anglers handle the fish we harvest. I'll set euphemisms aside for a moment and say it clearly. Andrew wants to change the way we kill fish. In fact, he believes in what he calls a considered kill. First, I should say ikejime is a traditional Japanese method for killing fish. As an island nation, Japan has always relied heavily on ocean fish for their dietary needs, and few places in the world can boast as sophisticated a seafood culinary tradition. And like so many things Japanese, the techniques for dispatching fish reached a level of near perfection there, not just eliminating as much suffering and stress as possible, but also producing the highest quality finished food product they can. The method, while requiring some skill, is fairly simple. Once fish are brought onto the boat or on shore, they're quickly killed with an ice pick-like spike inserted into their brain. Then their gills are cut to induce exsanguination, which simply means they're bled out. And finally, a long flexible wire known as a Ike-Jime wire is run through the spinal canal, destroying the spinal cord and eliminating any residual nerve impulses that would keep muscles contracting spasmodically, resulting in tissue damage, metabolic waste products, and chemical stresses that would ultimately reduce the quality of the final food product. Lastly, the fish is rapidly cooled, not just placed on ice, but in an ice slurry that completely surrounds the fish, ensuring quick and uniform cooling. While for those of us who fish, this may sound like a lot of extra logistical steps, especially when we're used to simply pulling a fish over the gunnels and tossing them into the ice box, it's important to note that similar steps are taken for the USDA-certified domestic meats we purchase in the supermarket, while fish somehow are still killed with unregulated and antiquated methods that produce inferior finished food products. This in turn reduces the value of the fish we catch, buy, and eat, meaning that commercial fishermen must harvest larger numbers of fish to be profitable. It's a quantity over quality paradigm. That's where Andrew Choi comes in. He's working hard to make ikejime part of our commercial fishing fleet's toolkit, providing both equipment and education, and working on policy as well. It's a lot more work. It adds complexity and a need for anatomical knowledge and keenly honed fine motor skills. It requires patience and consistency. But let's face it, we would never treat mammals the way we treat fish. Can you even imagine just leaving cows piled on top of each other, out in the sun, bleeding to die, convulsing? It's unthinkable. But that's what we've been doing with fish. Then we wonder why they last just a few days before spoiling. Chefs like Josh Nyland, who we've had on the show, are showing us that our fish culinary tradition is still in its infancy. Andrew Choi is showing us that it's not just how we cook fish, but how we dispatch them as well. So I'll be heading out on the water this year armed with the tools of the Ike Jime Federation. Brain spikes, Ike-Jime wires, and of course, the knowledge of how to implement these practices, all of which can be found on ikejimefederation.com. With all the time and effort I put into feeding my wife and I with wild foods, why would I skip these steps that can reduce stress and suffering, increase the shelf life and quality of our harvest, and culminate in an eating experience that surpasses anything I could get with conventional methods? So have a listen and consider becoming a forward-thinking angler, learning to humanely dispatch fish for their own sake and for a better final food product too. Like Andrew says, these are tools for the considered kill. Maybe it's time we all started practicing ikejime. Andrew Choi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to talk.
I'm so excited about it, man. I love your brand. I love what you're doing. And these tools that I've gotten from you are just fantastic. Thank you so much for what you do. Could you just tell folks who are listening what your brand is, what your company is, and what you guys do?
Sure. So I'm the founder of a company called the Ike Jime Federation. We have a very bold and ambitious idea to modify the way that American fish are handled at the time of death, which we think has for way too long blunted the potential, the opportunity, both for recreational and also commercial anglers. We think that it's been a little bit too long that American handling practices have been sort of overlooked, or maybe not as subject to development and attention as they could be. And as a consequence, a lot of people, especially, and communities, I should say, sort of suffer the consequences of that. We see patterns around the United States where, once vibrant fishing communities have fallen victim to globalization, climate change, changing fishing patterns, weather patterns, and also, I think maybe most importantly, a very, very confused oftentimes conflicting and contradictory regulatory system has just sort of made it difficult to figure out what the problem is, what the solution is, and how normal people can actually play a role in marine stewardship as people who eat fish as well. I don't think that they're in any way at odds. I don't think you need to be a vegetarian to be a marine steward. In fact, I would argue that this may be the most meaningful way to be a part of your community and advocating on behalf of it. This is a traditional Japanese practice, but the principles behind it are not the province of any particular country or any particular culture. Ikejime is a Japanese word, but we began in a lab measuring quality, right? We I think in the U.S. talk about quality and seafood quality in very basic terms like fresh, but we think there's a lot more to unpack. We think that work has been done in other industries, and not enough attention has been paid to that quality conversation in the seafood context. And so maybe we can unpack some of that today.
Let's get started. And first, let's zoom in on a real practical level for our listeners who aren't familiar. Just tell us what ikejime is and what that looks like. And then I want to get into this idea of, quote unquote, freshness.
Sure. So ikejime now is sort of a broad term to describe a very immediate, a very deliberate, and a very active handling process to slaughter a fish, but preserve the integrity of the muscle tissue for the highest class eating products in the world. So it begins by immediately euthanizing the fish with a brain spike and causing immediate brain death. The second step is to bleed or exsanguinate the fish. The third step, which to some is the more mysterious step, is the paralysis of the fish, and that is sort of effectuated by inserting a metal wire into the neural canal of a fish and destroying its spinal cord. And the last step is to rapidly drop the temperature of the fish by submerging it, the full body, into an ice slurry or a slush. So that's ikejime in a nutshell. That's also ikejime sequentially. So
do we have a direct translation for the term ikejime?
It basically means to like immediately destroy the brain. It means like closure. There isn't like a really clear transliteration, but it's like the sudden and immediate brain closure using a spike.
The first thing that occurs to me as we talk about this is just the strange dichotomy between how we treat our land animals that we eat versus how we treat fish that we eat, because all these processes are essentially playing out. I mean, they're slightly different, but these steps are sort of followed in the slaughterhouse environment now with, let's say, a cow, for instance. The cow gets the captive bolt to the brain. It gets strung up and bled immediately. They use electrocution to relax the nervous system. So really similar practices that we expect for our beef. But then when it comes to fish, having been on some commercial fishing boats, the idea of, that so many of the fish that we end up eating have suffocated to death in the sun on the deck of a boat. The idea of doing that with cows is abhorrent. Like, I can't even imagine a pile of cows asphyxiating and then that going into the U.S. food supply. But somehow we have this different standard for fish, and just kind of curious your thoughts on that. And do you feel what I just said has any accuracy to it?
So it's it's the perfect question. Um, and there's I have so much to say about this. The first thing to say is that you're absolutely right. The manner in which we slaughter um, cows, lamb, pigs is very deliberate. It is highly regulated, not only by a federal statute, but also subsequent regulations. We have an entire agency called the USDA that oversees that process, and that slaughterhouses are accountable to. And as a consequence, we also have different grades of beef. We have 8 different quality shields. Um, so there is a very, very robust industry need to have a lot of oversight over the manner in which cows and other land-dwelling animals are processed. Um, Historically, that the value protein in the U.S. has not been seafood. Um, in Japan, the value proposition is more inclined towards seafood. So, historically, their version of a cow was a tuna. And so, in the same way that we have an interest in protecting that value proposition for a cow, um, the Japanese had the same or similar interest in protecting the value proposition of a tuna. So then I guess the question then is, what is the value proposition, and how do we think about that? And um, there's a few ways to think about it. Like, one is just from an economic standpoint. Um, we consume a lot of beef in this country. We also export and sell a lot of beef outside of this country. And so it's incumbent on our federal government to ensure that quality and consistency is regulated, to shore up a very significant part of our food economy, and national economy as well. Seafood, I think, has been a blind spot uh, culturally, but as a legal matter, it's a very explicit blind spot. Seafood has been categorically excluded from certain legislation that oversees the manner of slaughter, like you just described. And so I think, a lot of the confusion and the distortion in a lot of the things we hear in this country about seafood and freshness and quality is attributable directly to a very, very complicated, and I would argue unresolved, national conversation about where seafood fits in, both as a legal term of art, but also as something that we have a relationship with culturally, because it's changing. Right? I think at some point, seafood was not a very mainstream or highly prized or valued food product or commodity in the U.S. But now we have a very, very sophisticated relationship. I would argue consumers have a very sophisticated relationship with their seafood.
And
But
what would you say in the last 15 years, maybe last 10 years, this has been happening?
It's interesting. I think it's regional. I think some parts of the U.S. Have come further than others. So obviously, some coastal areas have come further than some areas where they just don't have as much seafood at their doorstep. I think it also reflects patterns of immigration. Um,
Yeah.
I think it's affected by just industry, right? So in Alaska, they've got a very established salmon industry that sort of has a better opportunity to develop their economy. Maybe Nebraska is less so. So we're at different starting points. I think that the American consumer has been waiting for way too long. I think that American chefs have been waiting for way too long.
Yeah. There's a lot that I see happening. First, I want to just say, well, one thing I want people to know, because you keep bringing up the legal piece, is that you do have a law degree, and so I think I just understanding the scale of what you're doing. I hope folks will go over and check out your website, which is the ikejime Federation.com, and check out your pro shop in there too, your store, because like there's the tools to do ikejime, but as you dig deeper through the website, you realize like, oh, you have a much bigger vision. And this has to do with things like regulation. So that's why, we're talking about this. But first, I just want to say, Paul Greenberg, the sort of marine fisheries writer, his book, I think it was American Seafood, really hit home for me when he talked about one thing that surprised me was that shrimp is like the most eaten seafood by Americans. Like, in other words, finned fish are kind of just not as popular as I would have thought, being somebody who likes to eat seafood, and that the amount of our seafood that we export is just kind of shocking to me. I've just got some time. I just spent some time on a tuna boat, fishing giant Atlantic tuna here in the Gulf of Maine sort of area, and the fact that so few fish stay here, like I think most people know, most of those fish end up going over to Japan. But there's only this fledgling industry to keep any of them here. So just how underappreciated some of our own fish have been here is really mind blowing. And then this one other component I want to bring up, which something we've talked a lot about on this show before, is there's very little exceptions to this rule, but like generally you cannot hunt a wild animal and then put it into the U.S. food supply. Again, there's a couple of exceptions, but very minimal. Whereas our fisheries are still, largely based on wild fish. And
Yeah.
It feels like there's this sense of, because of that, because there's still this highly regulated here in the U.S., but worldwide sort of plundered still. I think it just feels like this Wild West environment in some senses, where all the practices can be still somewhat, it's like Civil War era surgery or something, the way we deal with fish. And so it seems like we are ready for some kind of huge overhaul. I'm almost amazed it's taken this long. What was the documentary recently on Netflix that was sort of, that like kind of horribly put together expose trying to make the American fisheries look really bad, but things like that are coming into the public awareness, which means we are going to have light shown on this. And so it seems like what you're doing, it seems like the perfect time.
Yeah. Okay. So you just said a lot, and I'll try to address these different things and not overlook anything. So yes, I'm crazy. I've got a crazy idea. And that is that I want to go straight for the jugular. And the jugular in this situation is the U.S. federal government. The structure that we have in this country is a confused, chaotic, and illogical scheme. So we have three different agencies that sort of oversee, quote unquote, seafood, but really no authorizing statute. So what that means is that you have these regulatory agencies that aren't really beholden to a particular general law. So beef is regulated primarily, or the authorizing statute was actually written in 1958. It was the Animal Welfare Act of 1958, and it regulates the way that cows are slaughtered. And so you mentioned the captive bolt stunner and these sort of bleeding protocols. That is explicit in that piece of legislation, and I would encourage folks to read it. It's fascinating, and it's
And that
also
was for the
fascinating
welfare of the animal. That's welfare of the animals,
well,
not
well,
quality of the product, or both.
Man, that's a fascinating question, because it is styled as the Animal Welfare Act of 1958. But let's be very clear where that came from. It came out of hysteria in the country in the wake of Upton Sinclair's books that shed light on what our animal processing practices were in the United States, which were at the time not just, value judgments aside, we were creating really, really poor products. So you could say inhumane, you could say cruel, but ultimately we had a problem with pale soft exudative meat, which was the direct consequence, or PSE, which
Exudative?
was exudative. Yep. So
What's that mean?
basically, it's pale meat. It's
Yeah.
soft meat, which means its tensile strength was just like terrible.
Right.
It was falling apart, and then it was exudative, so it was leaking water.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the direct consequence of stress. And they could prove this in labs,
Oh,
and it
wow.
was having a real impact on the value of our meat products. And so there was a moment that we had in the national conversation where the federal government had to step in and say, all right, enough of that. From a, if the cynic would say, from a economic perspective, um, and they started to and they knew that there were measurable consequences to how an animal is slaughtered, and they needed to be shored up, and they needed to have a lot of buy-in from industry, and they did. And they passed the Animal Welfare Act of 1958. And that is ground zero for our modern, uh, that's a starting point for our conversation about humane slaughtering practices.
Okay.
We can talk about like Temple Grandin later, but that was how it started. But interestingly, explicitly, expressly, fish and seafood were excluded from that.
Hmm.
So it was only applicable to certain types of animals. And actually, the word animal is where they excluded fish and seafood. So as a matter of law, fish and seafood are not animals.
Mm.
Um, so that's how we sort of began that journey. And we have that statute to thank for a very robust, a very coherent, imperfect, but very, very serious beef and pork industry in this country. Seafood has not had that piece of legislation, and so instead we have the FDA, which regulates safety and uh, food safety. So seafood must be safe, but they don't have authority to uh, provide for quality. NOAA regulates the fishery, quotas, licenses, things like that. The USDA has some touch over certain seafood products like surimi, canned tuna,
What's
or
surimi?
packaged tuna. Surimi is like the seafood hot dog. It's like imitation crab meat. So they
Oh,
would make imitation
yeah.
crab meat.
Okay, gotcha.
Um, uh,
I'm glad that's
some
regulated.
some
Now that you say
Yeah, I mean, well, hot dogs should be regulated.
it.
Cat, and then catfish,
Oh, wow.
which is a different story. Farm catfish. So we have but nothing else. So we have this very bizarre sort of governmental or federal structure around these animals that are um, in the water, but really no clear statute that either defines their existence, defines their significance, or shores up the delegation of authority to different regulatory agencies. So, seafood is sort of shoehorned into the Food and Drug Administration, which does tobacco and pharmaceuticals
Right.
and chewing gum, right? But why is seafood in there? Um, I mean, there are obviously safety issues for seafood, right? Like there's parasite risks and maybe some heavy metals or whatever. But really, the USDA, there's no analog for seafood. There's no one ensuring quality. There's no one ensuring sort of standards or let alone grades. Um, and so consequently, we have just a very, very complicated and confused picture of who's really taking care of this particular aspect of the national economy. And I think there's a lot of consequences to that. And yeah, I mean, I'm nuts. Like, I think that actually there is a strategy for depriving the FDA of jurisdiction over seafood. Um, I think there are ways to do this. I think that if this were the pharmaceutical industry, it'd be done in, a year. um, but seafood doesn't have the same lobbying power. It doesn't have the same levels of advocacy. It has been complicated in recent years by the farmed industry.
Yeah, I
So
bet.
wild seafood and sort of the American inheritance of wild seafood has kind of gone neglected for a really, really long time. And I would place a lot of blame at the feet of the federal government. I think that the federal government has not done a great job regulating foreign imports, which apply a downward price pressure on wild caught
Hmm. Yeah.
seafood. And as a consequence, commercial fishermen need to catch more. So they have a volume incentive in order to maintain current income levels. But as you increase volume, they start bumping up against a different agency, and that's NOAA and the catch quotas. And so it's hard to figure out who to point the finger at. So everyone's frustrated. The commercial anglers are obviously very frustrated. No one's looking out for them.
Yep.
And it occurred to me, like, okay, so how do we even begin trying to empower a forgotten industry, an overlooked industry that doesn't have either sort of statutory support, regulatory support, um, and maybe even congressional or congressional support. Like, who is looking out for these communities? And I think the answer right now is not many. There are several, but it's a very siloed industry, both from an advocacy perspective and also from an economic perspective. So my sort of approach was, well, all right, we're going to work on this. And if it takes litigation, if it takes lobbying, if it takes whatever, that is not an overnight thing. But in the meantime, what we can do is we can empower folks with the most basic, approachable, and sensible tools to transform a fish that you catch into a world-class seafood product that is the same, if not better, than what could otherwise be sourced from Japan. And
Okay, I
it
got to break
comes
it.
with just tools. Yep.
Oh, I just want to break in with a couple questions here and one comment. This is going to seem a little like off topic for a second, but I promise it comes back around. The new Batman
Are
movie's
we going to
out.
talk about Will Smith and Chris Rock?
No. Well, I mean, it's tempting. It's tempting, but I'm
Yep.
going to leave that one alone. The new Batman movie's out, and it in the soundtrack is a old Nirvana song, "Something in the Way," and it's just sort of like Kurt Cobain saying a bunch of what seem like random things, but he says in that song, he says it's okay to eat fish because they don't have any feelings, and that's been on my
Mm,
mind all week. I've been thinking about it as I've been thinking about talking to you, because he says it in a way where it's like as if this is this troubling thing that he's thought about a lot over the years, like, why is that? Like, why do we think of fish this way? Now, as somebody who handles a lot of fish, I certainly don't get that sense from handling a fish that, like, oh yeah, this is an automaton that has no nervous system or something. In fact, it has a very robust nervous system, and lots of pokey sharp bits to keep things from eating it. It just doesn't. I don't understand where this mentality comes from. So I guess one question I have is, I'm sorry, I'm going to stack questions on you again, but it's like, where does this mentality, or is this mentality that fish don't have feelings or fish don't feel pain, or all these kind of ideas that we have, is that underlie the paradigm that's like led us to this place where we find ourselves now? Second question, and I can I wrote these down so you can pick them apart one at a time. Why are you passionate about this? Like, why are you taking up this cause? I'm super curious about that. And then lastly, Is ikejime practiced widely in Japan in its commercial fisheries, or is this something that would happen more at a local level, let's say with discerning chefs or discerning anglers? So, yeah, I guess starting with like, why don't we care about fish? Like, why do we care about the feelings of mammals and not fish, especially at a legal level? We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first, hunting is as ancient as humanity itself. And through most of our history, it wasn't just about the physical pursuit, it was a spiritual one too. One of the ways human beings came to understand ourselves and our place in the wild world that sustained us. Hunting is still an incredible tool for personal transformation today, helping you discover more about yourself, your environment, the animals you share the world with, and even helping you develop a deeper understanding of life and death itself. Hunting can help you find your place in the community of life. But you could hunt all your life and never find that kind of transformation. It takes deliberate practice, awareness, and sometimes even initiation. That's why my friend Monsell Denton created Sacred Hunting. Sacred Hunting brings new or even experienced hunters out onto the landscape to stalk, harvest, and field dress animals in a retreat-type setting, in conjunction with sweat lodges, entheogenic plant medicine ceremonies, and strong intention setting that prepares hunters for a lifelong spiritual relationship with themselves, the land, and the animals they hunt. If you want to hunt as a tool for transformation, check out sacredhunting.com. Monsell and his team will guide you through beginner hunts, and more experienced hunters will find unique opportunities available across the country and globe. There's only a few spots available on each hunt, so go to sacredhunting.com and complete their 2-minute application. Discounts are available if you let them know you heard about them on the WildFed podcast. Again, go to sacredhunting.com and learn more about Monsell and Sacred Hunting on episode 59 of the WildFed podcast. Now, back to the show.
You know, I think about this first question all the time. It has haunted me for a long time because I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, so I think part of it is cultural. I think part of it's also like fish don't blink.
Yeah.
They just sort of like stare at you and
Yeah.
look surprised all the time. And so that's really otherworldly.
Yep.
It doesn't feel like you can't connect with a fish in the same way that you might connect with a blinking cow,
Yep.
a cow with tear ducts, a cow that is sort of twitching its nose. So there are some very, very subtle visual cues that maybe make us feel very distant from our underwater counterparts. I think that informs cultural attitudes. So depending on sort of what culture you're from, like fish can take a certain place in the overall sort of, hierarchy of beings. You are right that there, this conversation about fish having feelings or fish feeling pain has been subject to a great deal, a lot of spilled ink. David Foster Wallace comes to mind in his essay, Consider the Lobster. And it is a very thorny landmine, and has been for my project for a while, because it's a question about values ultimately. And I will leave those types of philosophical questions to people far more studied on it than me. um, but the best I can muster is that I and maybe this is a cop out. I use the term stress rather than pain,
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think that's great.
because stress is measurable.
Yeah, it's
So we
quantifiable.
can actually, yeah, you can like literally measure it in a lab. So we can measure it with like discrete indicators like cortisol. Fish
Mm-hmm.
do secrete cortisol. They release lactic acid. Their respiration rate goes up. Their pupils dilate. Their heart rate goes up. Their core temperature goes up. So they have color loss. So all of these things are observable, measurable, and knowable. So you can sort of take that and interpret that as your culture dictates, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if if those stress indicators in your context mean that that fish is experiencing pain or it's suffering or whatever, then I kind of leave that to you.
But there's
Or if
something
you're
there for everybody, because
doctrinally
it's like, do you want to, even if you don't care, like let's say you're a total sociopath about, animal stress or whatever that, but it's like, do you want to eat that still? So I mean, even if,
right,
even at a
right,
selfish level, it's like, but what quality of food do you want to eat? Because to me, I always imagined like, what kind of goblins want to eat like animals that suffer? It's just kind of creepy to me. Like,
yeah,
the idea of subsisting on things that have suffered before death, because as you're saying, it's like, we have a pretty good understanding now of what your blood looks like at a biochemical level when you're stressed, and it's like, don't really want to eat that, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but the impact that those chemicals have on the quality of the meat itself means that you're eating a sub quality meal too. So it's not just that it's
precisely.
maybe bad for you, but it's like organoleptically not very pleasant.
That's exactly right. And that harkens back to the earlier points that we were discussing about pale, soft, exudative meat and the origins of the Humane Slaughter Act. Um, these metrics have been studied. We know the data. Um, we just haven't quite taken that next step to connect all these dots about quality and apply them in a way that's kind of coherent and meaningful to your average American consumer. And so consequently, we have like basically just like these, wars about whether fish feel pain, but maybe that's like a distraction.
Yeah, it seems
Maybe
like it.
we've already sort of we've we've reached a certain conclusion, or we've all reached certain conclusions, right? So it's either I am superior to this animal, fish or otherwise, and therefore I am entitled to eat it, um, and I'll take responsibility for its death. Or I'm not, and I can't eat it. But if you've accepted the idea that you are going to eat it, then I feel like my job is to tell you, well, if you're going to do it, there's this beautiful paradox. And the paradox is that animal welfare and arguably some extreme brutality, or what may seem like brutality, is the precondition to world-class products.
You're saying that ikejime may come across as brutality?
Correct.
When I got your box in the mail and it said, I mean, the packaging is so beautiful. I really like how tight the brand is. It's like, it's a really well, everything, your logo, your stickers, everything's like really nice. And so I get the box in the mail and it says on the side, two tools for the considered kill. And I thought, like, what are the mail carriers thinking when they see this box go out?
I
It's like,
know, I know. There,
but I like that you're being so explicit, because I find myself constantly using euphemisms like a harvest, because it just makes it easier to have the conversation without those sticking points sometimes. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about, I'm watching the terminal ballistics of the bullets on the animals that I hunt, or, I'm
Mhm.
watching these fish die in my hands. So it's like, we need to be real about this at some level. So I get what you're saying about it being a sort of kind of like brutality, but at the same time, I mean, watching something asphyxiate seems to me like a lot worse.
Yeah, well, so the reason that I'm trying to be affirmative in the messaging here is because there has to be this distinction drawn between animals that can only breathe underwater and animals that cannot. Um, the conventional method of harvesting or taking or keeping fish is to simply remove it from water where it could breathe and let it suffocate to death above water where it cannot breathe. And to me, that's a passive act.
Hmm.
It's the omission of action. To say to affirmatively bring about death, to me, at least the word is kill. And so I want folks to feel that this is your responsibility and you are
Yeah.
doing it affirmatively, but in
Yeah.
the service of actually considering the life that you're taking, considering the quality, considering the implications of the seasonality of that take. I want you to kill, but I want you to consider the kill and
Hmm.
be accountable for it. Because what I think what's getting lost, or what's been getting lost for decades in this country, is this sort of is accountability. It's like, who is responsible for quality, right? Is it the FDA? Is it NOAA? Or is it the able hands of the person who is there at that moment of death?
Yep.
And I mean, newsflash, I believe it's the latter. but, um, but yeah, I mean, I think that it's easy to overlook these just really, really basic differences between things that are underwater and things that are not, right? So when you take a fish out of water, can't breathe, and it's never experienced gravity.
I
Like,
think
you
about
can
this
take a fish
all
out of
the
water.
time. I mean, I every time I pick a big fish up that I plan to release, I think about its feeling its weight for the first time unbuoyed by
Yep.
all of that substrate that it's usually in, and how intense that
Yep.
must be on its organs, how it must feel in the belly, you know?
What it told its friends when it went back down, it was like, you guys would not believe that there's
What's
this,
up
like,
there?
yeah, exactly. No, but it actually has also implications for the ikejime method. So if you're dealing with an animal that is removed from water, and it is feeling its body weight for the first time ever, and it's also feeling a hard surface,
Hmm.
um, for the first time ever, it's going to flip out, pun intended.
Mm.
And when it flips out, it is in a context that is entirely foreign and unfamiliar, and it will damage itself. It is basically thrashing and entering into a period of hyperactivity that is potentially very deleterious to the final product quality, especially if it's
If I
allowed to
flip
hurt
out like
itself.
that, if I were to move at that pace, the way like I'm picturing, bringing a tuna, bringing a mahi, bringing a halibut onto the deck, you bring them over the gunnels and they start doing what I don't know the physiology of fish, but for me that would be anaerobic. That level, that's like jump roping. So it's not like aerobic like I'm walking or jogging. It's like sprinting type stuff where your heart rate goes way up and you start dumping lactic acid, and that has a damaging effect on your muscles. And like as an athlete, I know like that requires recovery time that I
Yep.
don't need if I go for a walk or a jog. So the idea
Right.
that that's the last thing that you do and then you asphyxiate, it's like, well, where's all that going, and what's it doing to those tissues?
That's exactly right. And it's also, what is it doing to that muscle tissue over the period of time post mortem?
Hmm.
So,
Because it's
like,
not being
okay, so let's
metabolized
say
because the
it's
animal's not alive. Right.
right. And so, I always say, am I allowed to swear,
You can, sure.
on this? Sorry, I swear like a sailor, and um,
Great.
this is like,
We're
I'm
talking
trying
fishing, so
not
I think you
to,
have to.
but yeah. So I always say, like, if the fish has been suffocated to death, I don't care how fresh it is. Its product quality has already been so compromised that by the time it reaches land, it's really irretrievable. The quality is relatively irretrievable.
Hmm.
Um, so the conversation about fresh is just a massive fraud, because it can be fresh, but it's so acidic, it's hot, it's full, the carcass is still full of blood, so it's basically just a hotbed for bacterial proliferation. And you have an inferior product before it's even on land. And so I describe this as shitting the bed.
Hmm.
You did all this work, you spent all those fossil fuels getting yourself to the grounds. You did a lot of manual labor extracting this animal from out of water. And then at the last moment, you just shit the bed.
Yeah, it's
And
true.
that part's not necessary, right? Just go ahead and follow through, and it will transform not only the dockside value, but potentially the entire fishery. You can
Now
catch
that
less,
that makes sense to
and
me on a I think you're about to address it, but it's like again talking about the tuna fishery or let's say the halibut fishery, you're bringing up very few fish. So the idea of taking that extra time with each fish makes sense. When you're trawling, or or you have a very active fishery where you're bringing just hundreds of fish over the gunnels. How would that be handled? Because you'd need more hands, I'd assume. Even when I go out on a headboat to ground fish, I fish for pollock and haddock every year for the freezer, and it's difficult because the number of fish I'm catching is very high. And so it can be hard to deal with each fish because it means you're not fishing and then you're not
yep,
catching. So, yeah, I'm
yep.
kind of curious how you envision all of that.
So I think your question is about scale, and scaling. Um, so there are certain species that are obviously low catch rate species, right? So tuna, um, you're only dealing with a few, sometimes a few a day at most. And then there's also other species where if you're using like a trawl net or a drag net or something, you're dealing with a significantly larger volume in a much shorter period of time. So I think my first response is those fishing methods were devised as the product of a particular type of product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If what you're selling is something that's destined for pasteurization in a can, well, then there's a
Mm-hmm.
fishing method for that. If your final product is not, then there's a different fishing method for that. So I don't take it on. I don't take it uh, as truth that fishing methods or modalities are fixed. Um, Now, obviously, there are limitations to how a very discreet or careful handling method would be applied at scale. Um, and the one thing that I'll mention is that ikejime is a series of principles and not necessarily rules. So there are ways to mechanize, and they are in existence, ways to mechanize the speed of how you would process a fish under these principles. In some cases, you're using compressed air. In some cases, you're using exogenous water pressure. So, commercial salmon fishing in Alaska has, recently pioneered a lot of these pressure bleeding techniques, and
Okay.
that's using exogenous water pressure and not residual blood pressure from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Like that's fantastic, right? But that is a new innovation that has been the product of a demand for a superior quality product.
Yeah, because
So we do need
The
to.
salmon fishery there has been a lot of talk. I've seen it in quite a few books now reading about salmon. There's a huge demand now for a higher grade of salmon. So this is sort of one of those US fisheries that's like a kind of a test bed for a lot of the kind of ideas that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so our first advisor was John Rowley. Um, and I don't know if you're familiar with the late John Rowley, but he was
I'm not.
arguably the single individual who introduced fresh salmon to the mainstream American consciousness. So prior to John Rowley's bringing fresh salmon to the continental mainland for distribution in the mainstream market, salmon were only consumed out of a can. And that was because the handling practices in Alaska were so substandard that the fish had to be pasteurized and canned in order to be safe or fit for human consumption.
Mm.
But John Rowley was one of the pioneers in bonking a salmon and then bleeding it. And just those two little actions created a product that could travel. It had some shelf stability. And that was how he brought salmon fresh from Alaska, from the Copper River, into the continental mainland. Without that seemingly simple innovation on his part, we might not have seen fresh salmon for a lot longer.
Right.
And that was in the 1970s that he pioneered that effort. And so, credit to John Rowley for, bringing this amazing food source out of Alaska and able to travel the distance to the continental mainland and onto the plates of American diners not that long ago. But that's the direct consequence of a more considered kill.
Mm-hmm. Right. When I had asked you before too, is there anywhere in the world, Japan included, where this is practiced at scale, and if not, like how is it used in Japan, or in what context would you see it?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I forgot to answer that question.
Oh
So
no, we
in
were still on the
Japan,
first
it's
question.
definitely, yeah. Um, so it is, it's not optional for high valued species because this ikejime will protect the product quality for for a fish that will be that could fetch millions of dollars. So you don't leave it to chance when you're dealing with a you know 500-pound bluefin that's going to go for $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so categorically, those fish will be harvested under the most rigorous and intense and deliberate circumstances, and that involves a brain spike, a bleeding protocol, and a spinal cord destruction wire.
Mm.
Um, it is sort of species dependent as far as how automatic the application of some ikejime, shinkejime protocol will be in Japan. So obviously, if a fish is commanding a higher value or will be used for food applications that require the fish to mature in flavor or mature in age, then it's non-negotiable. If it's an anchovy or sardine, completely optional. Um, so
Yeah.
it depends on sort of what the final purpose is, right? So if someone intends to um, age the fish for a requisite period of time so that it's sort of peaking in flavor, and I leave and defer all of that to real chefs and real sushi masters, how they decide or determine when that muscle tissue is peaking in flavor and texture and for a specific application. If that is the final application, then there is no question that that this fish must be subjected to a very, very rigorous handling protocol. If it's going to be consumed immediately, it's different. That's certainly true in other Asian culinary traditions. Um, there is always there's no shortage of a variety of Asian and South Asian and Southeast Asian culinary traditions that are sort of contingent on an immediately killed fish that is pre-rigor, because the product and the final dish sort of requires a certain texture or requires a certain qualities in the muscle tissue, and so some of those are pre-rigor. The Japanese sushi and raw experience favors post-rigor. Again, there's plenty of qualifications there, but um, that's rigor is actually interesting. Maybe this is a good time to talk about rigor mortis,
Yeah, please.
and the shinke jime wire, and why it's central to the food conversation. So using a brain spike and exsanguinating a fish is sort of playing defense against a lot of these natural consequences that are going to happen. So we've talked about some of them, like the hyperactivity, the increased heart rate, respiration, cortisol secretion, lactic acid accumulation, those types of things. The brain spike will kind of shut down the opportunity and therefore preclude the fish from experiencing that. And so you're just sort of playing defense there. And then exsanguinating the fish is depriving the bacteria of having a substrate upon which to proliferate rapidly. And then, of
Hmm.
course, cooling rapidly is also bringing down the core temperature so that the bacteria are sort of slowed. The Shinke wire is maybe the more difficult one to, and it requires a little bit more treatment. Shinke Jime is the opportunity to play offense, and is playing offense against rigor mortis. Now you can't eliminate rigor mortis. Rigor mortis will always occur. But what Shinke Jime is doing is it's telling the animal, even though you may be dead, you can no longer use your muscles. And we all know that animals can continue to twitch and jerk, and in some cases just run around without a head, even though it's dead. And that's
I mean, I've
because,
experienced with reptiles, hours and hours of them appearing to
precisely.
still want to run. And, I watched a dead alligator. It had died. It had been dead an hour. I watched it get an erection, and it came
Mhm.
completely out of its, cloaca or whatever. I mean, really weird things where when that central nervous system still has coordination.
That that's exactly right. So then the question is, what's responsible for those continued, that long-term muscle reflexes? And the answer is electrochemical signaling that remains in the spinal cord. I mean, that is one of the primary repositories. So there's plenty of ATP left in the cells. The
Hmm.
question is there an electrochemical signal that can cause that ATP to expend and
Ah,
fire the muscle?
wow.
So even though it's dead, it's like a battery, right? So if you
Hmm.
basically just like taken the battery out of the fish, right, the muscles are still on full charge, or relatively speaking. But if there's still a circuit that's available to tell those muscles to fire, and there is, and it's in the spinal cord, then those muscles will continue to fire until they've completely exhausted themselves. And that total exhaustion isn't observable, like the obvious exhaustion, like you can see it stop eventually kicking, but at a cellular level, it's still continuing to fire.
Hmm.
So at the point that it's cellularly exhausted, that is the moment that rigor mortis begins. So if you've basically allowed the animal to exhaust its energy reserves quickly, it will go into rigor quickly. But if you cease any further electrochemical signaling to the muscle tissues, it will go into rigor much, much later. And that is the difference between world class and like really, really fresh. That wire
Yeah.
is everything.
Wow.
Yes, you can gain a lot of mileage by brain spiking and bleeding. But using the wire to really power down and sort of disconnect all that electrochemical signaling is the opportunity to take now what's otherwise a pretty awesome fish and bring it into the stratosphere. And
Yeah.
mastering that rigor mortis is exactly the competitive advantage that the Japanese have had for decades now. So yeah,
Yeah.
they figured out you could like you can get a really great product by brain spiking and bleeding. Fair enough. But when they mastered rigor, that was when it went from, you know, we've got good fish to we punch so far above our weight that our little country is the global superpower for seafood. And
Hmm.
it is attributable to mastering the principle of rigor mortis. And
Wow.
that is why the wire is critical. It's because you have basically taken a fresh fish and brought it into a totally different class. This muscle tissue, you've hacked the central nervous system. And so now this muscle tissue doesn't know it's dead for much, much longer.
Oh yeah.
And if
Okay.
it doesn't know it's dead, then what happens, and it's also deprived of this high bacterial load, and it doesn't have a lot of acid in it to cause these intracellular membranes to tear, then what you've got is you've got this like sort of this perfect and pristine fillet. And that fillet can age. So like I said, everything will go eventually into rigor, and it will eventually resolve from rigor. But the only thing that allows any muscle tissue to resolve from rigor, because it's dead, is enzymatic degradation. It's the enzymatic breakdown that will allow the muscle tissue to soften, sufficient enough for the muscle tissue to become flaccid again.
Mm-hmm.
But the byproduct of that enzymatic process are amino acids. And one of the primary amino acids is um, um, glutamic acid.
Now that when I
Glutamic
hear that,
acid,
I think monosodium glutamate, like makes me want
precisely.
to
You
eat
add a salt and
flavor.
you go from glutamic acid to a glutamate.
Okay, so
If you
this
have
is like a
monosodium glutamate,
savory
that's a
kind of
synthetic
umami
salted.
thing.
Precisely. And that's exactly what's happening with beef. That's
Wow,
exactly what's happening with the deer that you shoot. You have to hang it
wow.
so that it will resolve from rigor, and one, improve in texture so it's like tender, and two, develop that flavor. If it doesn't have the chance to go through rigor, it'll be sort of aggressively bland,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's just sort of like, it's you can chew it. It just doesn't have that deep, rich, savory
Yeah.
flavor,
Yep.
and that's the flavor that we get from beef. That glutamic acid is the flavor that is prominent in mushrooms, in shrimp, in cheese, in whiskey. It's in
Mm-hmm.
wine. These
Wow.
things that are that deep, earthy, savory flavor, that's glutamic acid. And so we get glutamic acid naturally. The problem with seafood is that it's decomposing faster than it can age in this country. So
Yeah.
it's decomposing because it's hot, acidic, and bleeding. And so it's going to actually spoil and decompose before the fillet actually has the opportunity to really fully bloom in flavor. And so that is the value add for ikejime, or fish that are subjected to a very rigorous handling protocol. That value add, I would argue, is measured in dollars. It's not a couple of dollars. It's like thousands of dollars. This is
Yeah.
like an
Yeah.
intense amount of money on the table,
Yeah.
because it can be measured in shelf life, and
Kind of
shelf
being
life, of
left
course,
on the table, right?
right. It actually literally just needs to be let alone
Mm-hmm.
for some period of time so that time can work to your advantage and not to your disadvantage.
There. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I know that was long-winded. I apologize, but that is sort of the key. Is rigor mortis is the key, and you see rigor being misunderstood a lot, right? You see folks get back to the dock and they're pulling their fish out of the cooler, and it's in the shape of a C,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll grab the head and they'll grab the tail and they'll force it flat
Yeah.
so that they can fillet it. But when you're forcing that fish flat, you've got to understand what's happening at a microcellular level. You're literally tearing or
Right.
shattering this matrix, right? And you're creating an increased amount of surface area in this fillet because you're literally creating new spaces. And then all those new spaces create more real estate for the bacteria to come in and start consuming that muscle
Mm-hmm.
tissue. And it's acidic. So this thing is on the fast train to spoilage. And that is a travesty, right? I mean, we should be able to enjoy our fish a lot longer. We should be able to share fish with folks,
Yeah.
and give
Yeah.
them a larger window of time for that fish to be fresh and delicious and perfect. But instead, we're just sort of always contending with these very mysterious, very opaque natural processes that we haven't quite sorted out yet. And so we're depriving ourselves of a complete and our economy of a really, really simple way to add value
It, it
by
seems like, are
not.
you
Yeah,
familiar? Oh, sorry. I feel like we have a little
that was it.
delay. I keep interrupting you. Are you familiar with Josh Nyland out of Australia and his book?
Yes.
Yeah. So, he's been doing a lot of the aging of fish and experimenting with fish quite a bit. And when I first, and, his approach is like, hey, let's treat fish more like we treat land animals. And when I first saw that, I couldn't get my head around it. It's like, what are you talking about? These things are like ticking time bombs. They just spoil so fast. But
Right.
talking about and slowly my mind's been kind of getting restructured around this. What I'm hearing from you sounds like the reason people feel like they need to eat fish so fast or so quote unquote fresh is because all of this damage has been done. Again, it brings me back to that Civil War surgery kind of analogy I used before. It's like we're in the dark ages with how we treat this stuff, and all the information's there, but it hasn't like caught up to our practices. I want to I'd like to talk about this from the recreational anglers perspective, because I think there's that's who's mostly listening today, um, and I want to talk about how we actually put this stuff into practice, because um, the brain spiking piece for me so far, I'll just share my own experience, has been a little hit or miss. And having gone through your website now, I'm like, oh, got it. This idea of finding that pre-opercular line and then intersecting it with the fish's midline, that's something no one had told me before. So I was always trying to find these x-rays of the fish that I was going after and like try to figure out where its brain was. And I've particularly struggled with the Shinkejime piece with the wire. I also want to just say, I know I sound like, as if you've paid me to promote your products here or something, and you haven't, but I ordered a kit before, which came from Japan, and it was just like hot pink, and it's like a wire and a spike. They had this kind of this look and feel that was like, this is not like anything I would normally order. They almost look more like sex toys or something the way they came.
Yeah,
It's very
they're
strange
very
stuff.
toy. Yeah.
Yeah, so the products you have are just the Shinkejime wires you have, and the way they have this sort of, I don't know, it looks almost dodecahedral, this little rubber
Yeah.
bead at the end of it, and then the way that they
Mhm.
they have this like nice flexibility, but they don't kink. I'm excited to start playing with them, but I've struggled with that piece of it. So, could you talk the recreational angler through this, especially like I'm going to be going. We've got our spring herring run about to happen, where they come up into our alewives, come up into our streams going up and rivers going up to the lakes, and we'll be dip netting them, and that's going to give me a chance to I'll just pull one fish at a time and experiment with this. I'm really excited about that opportunity. So talk me through it so that I get it right.
Okay, so the first thing that I'll say is our stuff is not pretty, and it's because we did not start. This wasn't a project for recreational folks, and the
I like that about it. I mean, this looks
the
practical to me.
support.
I'm like a Dexter knife guy. It's like every time I try to
Yeah,
buy like a
it's
super sweet fillet knife, it gets gross and disgusting, and my Dexters are what I always use. So these feel industrial to me. I like
yeah,
that.
yeah, it is industrial, and I wish it were a little slicker, but um, it's it's designed for commercial anglers, and I actually was very apprehensive about even making products available to recreational anglers. And part of the reason is because the value proposition for a commercial angler is very, very different than the value proposition for a recreational angler. That was what my thought. So you could measure, so the commercial angler could measure the delta in dollars. And the commercial and the recreational angler is just sort of like they're dealing with the improved food product, but it doesn't just sort of it's not as obvious to them. And so I did have some like misgivings about these are products that could invite abuse, right? Because they're not regulated, unlike in the beef industry. And so I was worried that the commercial guys that I've been working with that have made so much progress in improving their dockside price we're going to be compromised by some recreational bros that would cheapen all of the progress that they would made. And I say that with the utmost affection because I'm one of those guys, right? Like I know I'm an asshole too. And so the opportunity to like kind of stimulate some dead fish with this wire, I get it. It seems kind of cool. But there are people's livelihoods on the line, and so I was worried about sort of making
Wor-
these available
Worried
to
what? Help me
rec
understand.
anglers.
Like what consequence? I'm not sure I'm connecting with what you mean.
I just didn't want this practice to be cheapened or
Got it.
like turned
Okay.
into something kind of like
TikTok
silly.
videos. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's real money that needs to be shored up for these commercial guys. It's real money. It's not a joke. It's not a gimmick. It's actually someone's livelihood.
Hmm.
And so I just didn't want that to be I didn't want it to be a meme. I didn't want it to be, I didn't want there to be a distraction. I wanted these guys to continue to achieve these, you know, exponential deltas in dockside value without having to answer to other conversations about being cruel or being silly or being dumb or insensitive with fish. And so I did have some misgivings. That said, I've been proven wrong, and I'm here to say it, that
Nice. Nice.
the recreational community has been so overwhelmingly responsive, supportive, responsible, just so man, it makes me want to cry. Like I
Oh, wow.
feel like the rec folks have been wanting like a serious product that is keyed to their fishing experience, right?
Yeah.
So we've got wires of different sizes to give them this opportunity to respect what they've dedicated a lot of years to refining, and that's the art of fishing. And like there's a lot of folks that you know they they're really good at what they do, and that's the recreational angler. They've dialed in like what their retrieval ratio is, what the spline is on their rods, what kind of lures they're using. I mean, they are dialed in because they love the sport, and they also want to be able to enjoy what they've eaten. I mean, what they've caught at the highest level because they've been fishing at the highest level and they've been serious about fishing, so they want to eat serious. And all of my concerns, yeah, I have none. I have
Mm.
nothing but confidence now in the
Oh, that's great.
recreational community because they have just been so um, exemplary
Mm.
in understanding like the implications of what's going on here. And I think part of it is that this is an opportunity to add value through the water column. So, yes, it is and has been something that was almost the domain of large pelagic species like tuna. But if you overfish and collapse one level, you'll collapse the entire water column.
Hmm.
You'll collapse the water column of your home water. The chance to transform even groundfish or mid-column swimmers into a world-class eating product is the chance to add value up and down that water column and therefore add value to the entire fishery. And
Mm.
in my view, that creates this opening for a different approach to marine stewardship that bucks conventional terms like sustainable or traceable. It's actually now accountable. It's
Mm.
that you yourself are doing your part to actually demonstrate that you can have these superior products just by considering, not being a blowhard and not being self-righteous or sanctimonious about anything, but just by actually being a little bit considered about and just taking it as seriously as you take your fishing.
Yeah.
And all rec anglers get it, right? All rec anglers know that they're not buying some $500 reel because it's some shitty hobby. They're buying this stuff because they take their craft seriously.
Hmm.
And um, That's awesome. I mean, that's
Some of
and
us, it's
and
how
that
we
also
feed
just
ourselves, you know? It's like, I mean, this is what I'm gonna
exactly.
feed my wife this food. It's like, I want
It's your
her
tool.
to be
It's your
blown
tools.
away every time. Yeah.
Exactly. It's your tools. And so this is the chance to like kind of take out a lot of that insanity and get some clarity on exactly what it is that's in the way between that schooly tuna that you caught and something so transcendent on your plate that you were otherwise only able to access through some fine dining menu in a major city. There's
Hmm.
no reason that this is the province of Michelin chefs only. This is something unlike a cow that you have control over.
Yeah.
And that's really different. Like the opportunity to get out there and harvest a world-class meal is not something that should be withheld simply by lack of understanding or lack of tools.
Yeah.
I think that this is the great opportunity for people to actually craft an entirely new story for the American seafood experience. And that begins with your your recreational angler kid with a Rhino 33 in his hand,
Hmm.
all the way up to a commercial producer in the Gulf of Maine.
Yeah.
It also includes chefs who I think have been pining for the opportunity to tell the story of American seafood, which hasn't really been told before. Um, there hasn't been a chef with the opportunity to really source from different parts of the country for the full season, for the full year,
Hmm.
at
Yeah.
a world-class level, and explain like what are the corners of the United States, what are the natural waters, and when does this fish peak? When is it just perfect? And in March, I'm going to go to a different part of the country. I'm going to tell that story and I'm going to interpret that fish for you. That story hasn't been told yet. That story has yet to be written. And I mean, it's exciting as hell to me as someone who's not a Michelin star chef. Um, but it should be exciting even to your recreational angler who actually now has the opportunity to travel him or herself to different corners of the country.
Yeah.
And hey, Michelin star chef or not, you can experience it and really involve yourself in what that space has for you and how to really make it a part of your life and your person. So, very humble tools. It does require a little bit of practice. And so, getting back to your question about maybe some of the frustrations that you had at the beginning, yeah, I mean, brain spiking a fish sounds relatively straightforward. It can be a little difficult.
Yeah.
So, my only piece of advice is one, think of it like sort of like a human head and where your brain is. Like, where's that thing going to be, basically? Yes, I mean, a fish's brain is much smaller in relative terms to a human brain, but it's between the eyes, right? A little bit above. And if you end up perforating that fish's head, I don't care. Eventually you will figure it out. Now
Yeah.
there are guideposts. So like you mentioned, the preopercular line where it sort of intersects with the midline. Those are some great
And
guideposts.
for
But there
people
are also
listening,
fish
like
that
describe that, because the operculum being the gill plate that covers those
right,
gill rakers. But
right,
before
sorry.
that, describe what the preopercular line is.
So most fish have like the gill plate, which is called the operculum, and that's the part that you can lift up, right? You just lift it up. Right before that line is something called a preopercular line. Um, it looks like almost like a shadow of the
Hmm.
opercular gill plate. And that's just like this kind of easy guidepost. Like if you just sort of follow that straight um, north, i.e., towards the dorsal end of the fish, um, that's going to basically just sort of trace a nice line to where the brain is. But the midline, um, which by the way, like when a fish has a midline that's actually visible on its skin, those are technically like very, very fine hairs, right? It's how the
Really?
fish knows sort of where it's at. Yeah.
Yeah.
And and those are connected directly to the spinal cord because that's
Okay.
the most sensitive part. So you're actually, when you see the midline, you're literally looking at an image on its skin, like a like a superimposed image of its spinal cord.
Okay.
And where the spinal cord terminates in the head is the brain. It's connected. They're all connected. So if you sort of follow the midline and then sort of the top of the preopercular line, those are sort of general good guideposts for where the brain is. But hey, if you don't hit it the first time, try again. You
And
will
when you
eventually
do
get
hit
it
it,
dialed in.
I mean, you get a really clear, maybe you could describe those physiological responses that you see because it's pretty
Absolutely. Yeah.
profound. Yeah.
You will not be confused when you hit the brain. And effectively, what's happening is the fish will, because it's still full of energy, it will seize. And so there's a couple obvious signs. So one is the dorsal fin will flare. The gills will also flare, and the mouth will flare open. Depending on the sort of physiology of the fish, it may sort of spasm into a certain direction. Like flatfish, their tails may come up in the air. Um, the mackerel will, and mackerel are so interesting. Scombroids, of which tuna are a member. Those are fish that even after you brain spike them, they'll buzz. Um,
Hmm.
and that's partly why the Shinke wire is so important, because that buzzing, which is pretty unique to scombroids, needs to be stopped. It needs to be put down entirely. And so when you brain spike fish in the mackerel family, like Spanish and Atlantic and tuna and, um, you know, big eye, tho- those, as soon as you brain spike it, you'll actually see it almost like tremble a little bit. It'll kind of continue to just almost vibrate. And that vibration is the residual electrochemical signalings continuing to fire throughout the carcass. So when you brain spike, and actually maybe this is also a helpful tip to rec anglers. People often say, like, if they're coming over the rail, I don't have time to do surgery on this fish. Which I think is like a really hilarious way of saying, like, I hate your shit. But um, the the reality is that you actually have a good amount of time for that shinke process to occur a little bit later. So my advice is always, as soon as it comes over the rail, spike it, get that blood flowing, and then get back to your fishing if that's the
Okay.
situation, right? So when
Because
you're
I'll
on
bring up
them,
Atlantic mackerel 6 at a time, and then
exactly.
they're going usually into a bucket of salt water to bleed. So I could do that, and then I could Shinke wire them after. Because despite what people say about them, I like eating Atlantic mackerel. Real quick question: Do you tend to hold that spike like a screwdriver, or in the classic ice pick grip? In other words, is your pinky closest to the spike, or is
It,
your
it really
thumb and pointer
depends.
finger?
It really depends. It's kind of up to you. Um,
Because I imagine on a big tuna, you might need to kind of ice pick it to get in there.
yeah. Like, so with tuna, like especially larger tuna, the way to sort of position yourself is straddling the fish
Hmm.
with the head pointed forward and with
Okay.
its two swim fins in front of both ankles.
Okay.
And then you almost pull the spike back towards you.
Oh yeah,
Does that make sense?
it does. Yeah. Yep.
So if it's a smaller fish, hey, you know, stick it like a
Mm-hmm.
like a screwdriver.
Got it.
Um, like I said, these are not um, like most things, right? Simple implements, or short on technology, long on skill. Um, I think just what distinguishes our stuff, and I'm not gonna, blow smoke up anyone's ass. You don't need much. That's the reality. To brain spike a fish, you can use, and I have used, a sharpened screwdriver
Hmm.
or an unsharpened screwdriver. You got to get the business done.
But the
But
shinke wire is not as easily manufactured from something at home.
correct,
It seems a little
correct.
more.
No, the Shinke wire is much more specialized. But the thing I'll say about using sort of home brewed equipment is, if you one like screwdrivers and those kind of things are they're tooling. It's tooling steel. So as soon as it's near salt water, it'll just
Hmm.
corrode and rust. Fine, it'll still get the job done. But do you put that stuff in your food? Like,
Yeah.
it's, I mean, I'm not objecting to people being resourceful, and I am like that too. And that's part of the angler's DNA, right? You've got to find solutions all the time. But hopefully, this is just some opportunity for folks to have a very basic implement that's marine grade steel, and that's it. And it doesn't make French fries, and it doesn't change the TV channel, but it's just gonna, like, it's gonna always do the job, and fine, like, move on. The Shinke wire is very specialized, and the reason it's specialized is because people do try to. This one's less easy to sort of like scrounge up at the hardware store. So the the neural canal on different species um, obviously changes, right? So tuna, you got a lot of, a lot of hallway. Um, by contrast, like on a porgy, you don't have as much wiggle room. So you need a different size and diameter to get through a porgy as you might with a tuna, right? And there's also different lengths. So if you try to use like aluminum baling wire or some kind of like other metal implement, go for it. I'm not like, that's totally fine. What tends to happen is it'll kink and it'll buckle.
Yeah, it doesn't have that
And so
resiliency that I see in these.
yeah, definitely. And actually, the resiliency and the ability to just kind of keep on like doing it over and over again, and it'll never kink, and it'll always sort of flex along the contour of the fish. That's really, that's something that commercial anglers have to have. Recreational
Yes.
guys, I mean, if you want to just sort of try aluminum baling wire, be my guest. Some folks use like multi-stranded leader, like titanium leader wire.
Okay.
Not
Yeah.
mad at you. It's just not hygienic for repeated use.
Hmm.
But if you can actually get down to like a millimeter, less than a millimeter, into a porgy with multi-stranded leader wire, send me a video. I'd love to see it. Like,
Yeah.
that's like you win the prize, because it's
Yeah.
really, really hard for that thing to fish it down, and for it to be rigid enough to power through the neural canal, and not buckle, and then to have another fish to do it on. So, I don't feel as strongly about promoting or selling our products as I do that people have a really good and positive experience. And that's partly why, we didn't try to like dilute our commercial stuff. We were just like, well, then you guys just use the commercial stuff.
Mm.
And so, like, if you have a porgy, or if you have like a smaller fish with a very, very narrow neural canal, you it really helps to have a very specialized wire. If you are dealing with 300 to 600 pound class tuna, you can get away with more. You can get away with, I mean, people always talk about like using a coat hanger. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, use it, but a commercial angler it's just like not gonna work.
Right.
You just need something more robust. What does happen for commercial guys is they'll use like 600-pound mono for tuna, and you can get away with that. But 600-pound mono is not going to go down the neural canal of porgy.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and then the last thing that I'll say is the I don't think that the average American has any appreciation for the species diversity that we have here in the US.
Right.
I think that a lot of that stuff is actually very obscured from view. Um, and, partly because there isn't a ton of diversity when you go to this seafood market. Um, but we have the second most marine biodiverse ecosystem in the world. And what we have access to in this country is shocking. But what we have access to eat is a tragedy. And some of these folks, especially the recreational guys and gals that are in the Gulf, that are in New England and Florida and California and North Carolina, like the the fish that they pull up is incredible, and they are incredible eating fish. And these fish would command prices that are astronomical in Japan as a live animal, but as a dead product, maybe not. But this is the chance for recreational anglers to have access to food that no one has access to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the opportunity to like dangle a hook and line in a reef or in an oyster bed or something you can't drag a trawling net through there. So the species that you have access to by hook and line is intense.
Yeah.
And the opportunity to eat those fish is amazing. Like I always talk about sheephead.
Yeah. So
What
good. Huh?
what an unbelievable fish, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the stuff is just the meat is so sweet,
Mm-hmm.
largely because they're feasting on crustaceans all the time. But those are not fish that are really easy for commercial netters to get their hands on because of the habitats they live in. So really the only folks that can more readily access that particular species are wreck anglers. And that is a privilege. But imagine now you can harvest those fish and eat it at a world-class level that really no one in the US has access to. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Um, mutton snappers,
Mm-hmm.
all the different types of snapper. Like actually, we have so many different types of snappers. Most folks only know red snappers, but we've
It's
got
hard,
queen
hard to tell
snappers,
them
lane
apart
snappers.
once you're down there in Florida, let's say.
Yeah,
It's like, which snapper is this
that's
one?
right. That's right. Um, we have many different mackerel species. So we've got kings and Atlantic and Pacific and Spanish and uh, geez, albacores and tunas. The chance to have such access to not only a nutritionally dense food, but also a nutritionally dense world-class product, I think is unprecedented in the history of this country. And so the more that we can just sort of make even the most basic, elementary equipment available for folks to actually explore and discover these things and revisit maybe some of these species that have been overlooked that we have previously considered bycatch or ground or trash fish or whatever. I hope that we can change the conversation about value, about um, what's possible,
Yeah.
about what types of fishing methods are appropriate, um, and how we can all be our own activists for our own water. I don't profess to be, some expert in Northwestern water, but I hope someone wants to be. Um, I don't profess to be an expert in Southern California water, but I hope someone wants to be.
Mm.
And I hope that we can just help support those people's journeys to help us understand what's going on over there. What is the fishery? What are your fish that we haven't seen before? Show us. Show us and the world like this world-class product that we know is there as a live animal, but show us the world-class potential as a product. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm excited about.
So I'm going to post along with this, we'll put in the show notes some video footage of you kind of going through the process. You made a great video with AFCO where you go through all these steps and show people how to do it. How do people support what you're doing? And where do you want to send folks? Because it seems like you've got a pretty big mission. And,
Yeah.
aside from getting on board, I mean, I just want to see the folks listening to this to get on board with these practices themselves, but also like at a bigger picture level, is there a way we can support what you're doing?
Yeah. Well, first, I can't believe I forgot to mention AFCO. AFCO has been our partner in our journey into the recreational fishing space. And they were part of why I feel so much comfort with the recreational community. They've given us, just a tremendous platform, but also access to a lot of commercial charter boats and
Mm,
captains
yeah.
that have been wanting to integrate a more sort of considered process um, into their charter fleets for clients that may have, at one point been traumatized by, a past experience. So, and the opportunity to send folks and clients home with what really they should be paying for is a world-class fishing and eating experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had just, the great pleasure of talking with a lot of the other folks that are AFCO pros, that are charter captains and otherwise, and learning from them about how great the need is for a protocol like this for themselves, for their clients. And so it's just been a real blessing to work with AFCO. So I'd encourage folks to also, check out the AFCO website for our co-branded line of products as well. I just can't say enough about the AFCO community um, and the folks that I've met through AFCO. Um, and then as far as supporting us, so we just established a nonprofit. And our nonprofit will be coming online maybe in the next few months here. But it's designed to be the counterpart to the Ike Jime Federation tools and brand. But it has a very different dialogue and mission. And it's called the American Water Column Foundation.
Mm.
And I regret that it's not fully baked right now. But it is a nonprofit that is designed to support commercial and recreational anglers, but also folks that are in the academy, maybe folks that are politicians or regulators, chart a new path forward that is focused on this urgent need to really reconsider the water and reconsider the value of the water. I don't think enough attention is paid to considering the water as a food source. Um, there's there are plenty of organizations that are designed to promote conservation and marine stewardship, but not necessarily through the deliberate act of eating it and eating through it. And so that's kind of our distinction. And so as it comes online, I will be promoting that as well. We also are, working with CCA directors around the country. So we'll be doing trainings if for both commercial and recreational anglers, if there's an interest
What's CCA?
in doing that. Sorry, Coastal Conservation Association. So
Okay.
there's CCA chapters in every state. And I encourage folks to support their local CCAs because they do a lot of really important work, both in commercial and recreational fishing. And I don't want to actually, maybe I should say this too. I don't want to make this clear dichotomy between commercial and recreational, because that's not true. Commercial and recreational fishing are not as easily distinguishable from one another as,
especially
say,
in the tuna world.
yes, exactly. Like farmers and hunters are different, but commercial fishing and recreational fishing, they're not as discrete from one another. So there is a lot of interplay and alignment between the commercial and the recreational fishing worlds, and CCA does a tremendous job in shoring up a lot of those relationships and that shared advocacy. So I would encourage folks to, support their local CCA. Stay tuned for our 501c3 that's forthcoming, and get out there and give it a whirl. And it's not, you don't master this overnight. Practice, and it's okay if you don't get it right the first time, but practice. And hopefully we've got some tools for you that will give you the opportunity to make some mistakes, but always be able to bounce back. And anglers are, like I said, if just the most resourceful people, and dogged and pig-headed. So I have nothing but confidence that everyone's going to be able to figure this out. It takes a little practice, but it's not rocket science. It's just patience and practice, and that's what that's anglers' fortes, right?
Yeah, well, it's we're just getting close to our open water fishing season really kicking off here in Maine, so I'm gonna definitely be putting this stuff into practice once we get back out on the water. So yeah, I really appreciate these tools. I appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate that there's such a big picture vision as well. So yeah, whatever we can do at WildFed to support you, man, we're this is just really exciting to me and a direction I want to see things go. So thanks so much for your time today, and thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being such a voice for the folks that really need it. And that's folks that depend on wild world. And I say world because it's both above water and below.
Yeah.
So that the world is big. 71% of it is covered in water. So, we support what you do, and thank you for the opportunity today.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.